Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows come the best indie podcasts.
Hello, hello. I'm Courtney, and this is The Book of the Dead, a true crime podcast based out of New Jersey. For those looking for a podcast that focuses on the victims and who they were, or cases where the family is directly involved in the telling of their loved ones' stories, each chapter of this podcast is dedicated to the victim they feature. Here, you can find cases you may have never heard of, or interviews with experts that have dedicated their lives to protect and serve, and occasionally hear from the victim themselves. So get comfortable, grab a drink, and settle in for another chapter of the Book of the Dead.
Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host, Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey everybody, I'm back. It's another episode, and I'm excited to be here. I decided to tackle a huge case. Betty Broderick, she's glutinous lady. Betty Broderick is a big case, but not as big as good old Richard Ramirez, which is what I'll be doing this week. Before I get into that, I just want to say the world is on fire. Everything sucks. And if you're a capitalist, you are poop. Don't listen to my podcast. Go away. You suck. That's all I have to say about that. Power to the people. Anyway, I hope you've all been having a great week. I've been having a great week, working my ass off. I just hit my mic. Sorry. Basically, I just do work and then take my kid to various baseball games. But it's nice because a lot of the teams he plays with are like very good friends, not only of his, but of our family. So it's kind of nice. But man, is my social calendar packed. It's crazy. So it's a Saturday. It's like, what time is it? 6:30 p.m. I'm going to record for a little while and then the Dodgers come on. And yes, I do watch the Dodgers. Not ashamed to admit that I like true crime and baseball. And then when that's over, maybe I'll finish up. Maybe I'll finish tomorrow. But either way, I'm going to get this to you on time. Following a bi-weekly release. I might split I will be splitting Richard Ramirez into 2 parts. And the first one, so I might do them back-to-back weeks instead of making you wait 2 whole weeks for the second part. We'll see how everything nets out. But I make no promises, but I am hopeful, and I believe you should be hopeful as well. Anyway, so we're going to get into the case of Richard Ramirez, otherwise known as the Night Stalker, and otherwise lesser known as Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez, which is the name that he was born with. So this case is pretty close to my heart because I was actually living in Orange County, which is very close to where he did most of his killing when these murders were taking place. I was only like a year or 2 old. No, that's not true. Yeah, no, it is true. I was like a year or 2 old, but like my family remembers it. You know, my friends who are older than me all remember it. I think he only killed 1 person in Orange County, but like that's enough to cause a panic when he's on the loose. If you guys don't know this case, first of all, what? But he killed a lot of fucking people. So if even one of them is somewhere near you, you are not sure whether or not you're going to be the next one. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, one of my older friends actually told me that when this was going on, he was sleeping with a hunting knife under his bed, like just to be safe. Which is weird because as we get into this case, you'll see that a lot of people had weapons and it didn't always work out well for them. But I mean, still worth a shot, I guess. And I also want to say that same friend and my uncle and a bunch of other people I know were in a band. They were actually fairly popular in the 90s in Orange County. They were called Vitamin L, and they released a song called Richard Ramirez, and one of them gave me permission to play it at the end. It's not great. They were like the perfect example of 90s rap rock, so I want to apologize, but I also think it's really interesting to hear. First of all, the 90s are back right now, so maybe everybody will love it and it'll reignite like this Vitamin L comeback. I don't know. But it's just funny because they're like a goofy band, and so the lyrics are kind of funny, but it also really like, you know, shows that people, this was a huge thing. Richard Ramirez was a huge thing for people in Southern California, including my family and my friends. So I thought I'd just add it at the end here, just, for funsies. So anyway, let's get into the tale of the Night Stalker, otherwise known as Richard Ramirez. Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born on February 29th, 1960, which is a leap year, so just keep that in mind. Already a bad sign. He was born in El Paso, Texas, to one Mexican and one Mexican-American parent, both of whom lived in Mexico but moved to Texas to work for a better life for their children. His other siblings, before I say, I believe that there different books will put different names. I read some of his niece's memoir, but she wasn't clear. Hers more like poetry almost, like her book. So all of the siblings and like aunts and uncles, like it's difficult to tell who's who. And then there was another book written and they kind of changed the names of some of the siblings. And I'm not exactly sure why, but I believe his siblings were Reuben, Robert, Julian Jr., and Rosa. Or Ruth. I'm sorry. I think her name was actually Ruth. Now, Julian and Mercedes were married in Juarez, Mexico, and moved back and forth over the border for a time until Julian was able to get his citizenship in America. So Richard was the youngest of 5 and was born in America after both of his parents were able to legally live here. Now, Mercedes was an American citizen by birth, having been born and raised in Colorado, but didn't actually learn English for most of her life and was even once deported, along with her 2 young American citizen children, by El Paso police, who shockingly were not interested in the actual law, but rather just wanted to deport brown people at random, which sounds, very unfortunately, very familiar. So anyway, something interesting about El Paso and its border-sharing Mexican counterpart, Juarez, is that for a time they were both just downwind from some very serious nuclear testing, specifically the 1945 Trinity test. And when the wind blew just right, which it did pretty often, both towns would end up covered in the fallout from these nuclear tests. Now, our government, ever a pillar of honesty and justice, did their best to cover this up, but all throughout the late 40s and into the 50s, babies in this area were born with severe deformities, including issues with their bones, brains, and lungs. Richard's older brother, Joseph, who I actually don't think I mentioned. So it was Reuben, Robert, I don't know. Anyway, Julian Jr. might have been Robert, might have been anybody. Anyway, one of his brothers had bones that grew in crooked and had to have them shaved down by a doctor, which was horrifically painful and did not cure the issue, but at least allowed him to walk mostly unaided, which was sort of the best he could hope for given these deformities. One of his other brothers, I believe his first brother, was born with giant, knots all over his head, like half golf balls sticking out all around his head. But those went away, and after that, the family just kind of figured he was okay. Now, the family was poor, but the parents loved each other very much. That being said, they both had to work really hard jobs, manual labor. And while pregnant with Richard, his mother, Mercedes, was working in a boot-making plant using chemicals to treat and paint the boots. And beyond the possible fallout exposure the other children had been exposed to, Richard's unborn body was being subjected to chemical toxicity that was so bad, his mother's doctor told her she had to quit or she would lose the baby. And she did quit for a time. She did go back, but she did quit. And however, whatever warning she was given, when Richard was born, he was healthy as far as anybody could tell. There was nothing outwardly wrong with him, no bone defects or breathing issues like all of his other siblings. Now, that being said, as he got older and even as a baby and a toddler, he was extremely hyperactive. He could never sit still. He always wanted to run around and play and dance. And that to me sounds like ADHD, which could have definitely been from toxicity to something, some sort of toxicity in the womb. Now, Richard loved music from a young age and would hyper fixate on listening to music, as well as trying to figure out how to turn the family's radio on by himself so he could dance. This started, according to his mother, before he was even a full year old. She would put on the radio and Richard, or Richie as they called him, and I will use that interchangeably at least in his young life, would bob his head and tap his feet in time with the music, even before he could walk or talk. Now, this was very cute, but also a very particular thing about Richie, and it was also, unfortunately, something that led to yet another setback for him. Beyond whatever the chemicals did to his brain in utero, Richie also had a very scary near-death experience when he was only 2 years old. His mother actually, like I mentioned, went back to the boot factory, and his father was a railroad track layer, so both would be away from the house for many hours a day. The other kids were all quite a bit older than, not quite a bit, but at least like 5 years older than him. So they were all in school. But Richie, being only 2 years old, had to have a babysitter. And this babysitter would watch him in the mornings until his older siblings came home and took over. Now, one day, 2-year-old Richie asks this babysitter over and over to turn on the radio so he could dance to the music. She was watching TV and told him no over and over and refused to pay any attention to him. Now, the family radio was on top of a very heavy shelf, so Richie decided he would climb said shelf and turn the radio on himself. Instead, he ended up tipping this very heavy shelf over onto himself, mainly onto his head, which led to him being knocked unconscious for 15 minutes. Now, 15 minutes is an insanely long time to be out from a hit to the head, and especially when you're that young. So this was a very serious concussion type injury. He was taken to the hospital where he received a few stitches, and doctors said to keep a close eye on him as he was very concussed and that he should be monitored while sleeping for the next few days. He eventually seemed fine, but this was a very scary accident and a head injury that he received as a child. A few years later, Richie was at the park with his older sister, I believe her name is Ruth, and ran towards her on the swing without thinking. She swung forward directly into his forehead, knocking him unconscious and putting a huge gash right in the middle of his forehead. His older brother carried him home, and his mother took him to the hospital where they again stitched up his head and told him he would be, quote, fine. So here we have 2 major head traumas before he's even 10 years old, along with whatever poisoning he endured in utero. So obviously not a great combo going on here. Like I said, his other, siblings had breathing issues, physical deformities, but Richie, seemed to come into the world unscathed, which made these traumas, even worse, because it's like, wow, maybe you wouldn't have been so bad, so bad off, but, the fates took care of that. But again, I don't think he was fully unscathed. I think his issues were like more than skin deep. But anyway, now when Richie was in the 5th grade, he had a grand mal seizure in class and then another one the next day. Also, sorry if it sounds a little different. My mic actually turned off and I didn't realize it. So I was just fucking going for fucking 10 minutes with my mic off. So anyway, okay. When he was in the 5th grade, he had a seizure and then another one the very next day. He then had multiple seizures, multiple times a week for about 6 or 7 years until somehow he eventually mostly grew out of them. Even before then, though, his sister said that when he was really young, like a year old, he would stare off into space. He wouldn't respond to anybody. He wouldn't interact with the other kids. He would just kind of disappear for 15 minutes at a time. And the family later realized that he was having petit mal seizures. So even as a baby, he was having seizures. And they only later realized what was going on. So I don't think that was from the head trauma because they were happening before that. So was it the fallout exposure? Was it the chemicals? Was it just how he was born? We'll never know. Now, besides these traumas, his home life also wasn't great, though it was far better than I think a lot of people are led to believe. His parents were deeply religious and very strict, but they did love each other and all of their children. Now, his father didn't drink for most of Richard's young life, but he did have anger issues, which he mostly took out on himself, but often in front of the family. So if he was trying to fix something and it wouldn't work, he'd put his fist through the wall or punch himself in the head. He was irrational at times, and his children were exposed to this their entire lives and even seemed to kind of share in these violent outbursts here and there, or they sort of manifested in different ways. For instance, his sister, Richie's sister, would lose her temper and hit her brothers. And while his older brothers weren't necessarily violent, they did start getting into trouble in their preteen and teen years, doing things like sniffing glue and eventually breaking into people's homes and stealing things. They also got into drugs like weed and LSD, which their very Catholic parents were extremely unhappy about. After one of Richie's older brothers got arrested for breaking and entering, their father beat him very badly. And he did this with their mother's blessing, as both parents were horrified that their children would ever behave in such a way. Unfortunately, this did not keep their kids from continuing to behave poorly, which could have come from, trauma before birth, living in a poor area, having a father with anger issues, or who knows why, really. But whatever the reason, the older siblings began acting out a lot, and Julian began hitting them more and more in response. Their parents had always wanted good lives for their children, so seeing them behave in this way broke both their hearts. And again, I don't think it's okay to hit your kids, and I want to make that extremely fucking clear. However, back in the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s, it was a fairly, it was fine. It was, nobody was getting arrested for it. It was a fairly common thing. It was pretty, considered pretty okay. I can't think of the fucking word. It was accepted. There we go. It was an acceptable way to punish your children. So when you hear like, oh, Richard's father would like hit them when they were bad, it's like, yeah, a lot of parents did that. And I'm not saying that his family life wasn't worse than other people's, but I do believe that people are like, oh, his dad was a violent alcoholic. And it's like, yeah, as time went on, he definitely started drinking and things definitely got worse. But for many years of Richard's young life, it was a fairly standard, like, Catholic family upbringing, which I think is interesting and also important to know, because I feel like people are like, oh, he had a bad home life and that's why he acted that way. And it's like, not necessarily, right? Anyway, whatever reason the siblings had, they began acting out a lot. I said that, sorry. And as a result of that, Julian began drinking more and more and became more and more violent against the brothers. Even Richard's sister Ruth wasn't immune and eventually moved out, marrying the first boy she could right at age 18 to get away from the family home. Now, for her, it wasn't so much about getting hit as it was just the extremely strict home life that they all had, which, again, fairly commonplace at that time. Now, Richie, though, later a crazy person, he was actually quite good in school in his younger years and was well behaved when he was young. At least at first, he definitely was not a target for his dad. But unfortunately, that didn't keep him from being a target of other adults. Richie, actually, and two of his older brothers were molested by a junior high teacher who taught classes for kids with learning disabilities. Two of his older brothers were in that class and later said that their teacher, Mr. McMahon, would sexually abuse them, even going as far as coming to the family's home under the guise of helping them with homework and molesting them right under their parents' noses. Both brothers said they knew it was wrong, but they didn't care because it, quote, felt good. When asked if Mr. McMahon also abused Richie, both brothers said they weren't sure, but that Richie was definitely over at his house a lot during this time. Now, Richard, for his part, later said that if it happened, it was when he was 7 or 8, so he very well may have blocked it out. To me, that means he was definitely abused as a child. I feel like that's just an answer somebody would give if they don't want to talk about it, So again, just another recap, we have a lot of things going on here. Potential poisoning and fallout in utero, head trauma at a young age more than once, untreated epilepsy, and sexual molestation. And on top of that, as Richard got older and his older siblings moved out, his father got meaner, drank more, and would take his frustrations on what he saw as a failure to parent his children out on Richard, to the point where he was beating him regularly. Without his older brothers at home, Richard had nobody to protect him and wasn't really able to defend himself as he was still so young, only around 10 or 11 at this time, because remember, he's much younger than his, older siblings. So not a great home life, but it certainly wasn't the worst of his problems, sadly. Even still, like I said, in his younger years, he was a pretty good kid. He was athletic, and he actually played sports all through school and even in high school for a very short while. He played Little League, he played football, and in high school, not only did he make the football team, but he was actually the quarterback. And he played super well and showed a ton of promise. That is, until he had a grand mal seizure after practice one day and was immediately kicked off the team as his coach didn't want that responsibility on his hands. While I completely understand where his coach is coming from, I personally believe this was one of the last straws that truly pushed Richard over the edge into the life that we all now know him for. I mean, he didn't have a lot of good things in his life, right? But he had sports and he was good at them. And then that was taken away from him for something that is not his fault. That's just so unfair. Even before then, though, things did start going awry in his life, and I've kind of touched on that. But one of the main things that happened was his older brothers had actually spent a good amount of time with their older cousin, Miguel, or Mike, as everyone called him. Their father had warned them to stay away from him, saying he was a drug user and a bad person, but that only made them want to be around him more. When Richard was 12, Mike came back from Vietnam, and the two began spending a lot of time together. His brothers had already moved away, so at this point it was just Mike and Richie. Mike, unlike most people, actually really enjoyed being in the war and took pride in how many women he had raped and in how many Viet Cong ears he had cut off of his enemies after killing them. So there's a belief that you don't get into heaven if your body's not intact. So it was common for American soldiers to mutilate their enemies' dead bodies to keep them from going to heaven. It was adding insult to injury. And the way that they would count these is by cutting off their ears. That's what they would, mutilate to make their body not whole. And then they would string them on necklaces and fucking wear them. Like, even knowing that I wrote these notes, I'm still shocked and disgusted by that. I'm so, ugh. As terrible as that sounds as a baseline for soldier behavior, Mike was even worse and went farther than most of his war buddies. When he came back home from the war, he brought with him a suitcase full of Polaroids. And on these Polaroids was some of the most depraved shit you can imagine, and trigger warning because I'm going to tell you about them. What was on these were Vietnamese women being forced to perform oral sex on Mike or being raped by Mike in one photo, with the next photo showing Mike standing with their severed head in his hands. And he was showing these to Richard when he was only 12. And what's worse is that Richard loved what he saw. Now, he'd seen porn before, but this aroused him in a way like nothing ever had. The violence, the domination of the women, he loved all of it. Mike was like a god to Richard. And though most of us would see Mike as a very evil person, Richard Ramirez had his very first real hero. Now, at some point, despite Richard's father really, wanting to control Richard and all of the kids and using violence to do this, eventually he sort of gave up. And I don't think that means that he stopped hitting them or tormenting them, but I think he was just kind of fuck it. My kids are a mess. This is my life. That's it. So between kind of yelling at and beating Richard, he mostly just kind of ignored him. And Richard ended up spending more and more time with Mike. And eventually he did this with Julian's blessing, because Julian was like, you know what? It's family. At least you're not hanging out with random, hoodlums in the street, right? Not the best call, but, I think he was just trying to rationalize it. He was trying to rationalize what he couldn't control. Now, when Julian did kind of still spin out, Richard would leave with a sleeping bag and go sleep in the cemetery across the street from their house. He was afraid of monsters, because remember, he was only about 12 years old when he started doing this, but he found the cemetery quiet and peaceful and would come home after Zad left for work in the morning. So this is the way he would kind of get away. So he's either sleeping in the cemetery or over at Mike's house. And Mike had been married before going to the war and remained married when he came back, but not exactly happily so. His wife, Jessie, was a pretty woman with a strong personality, and she was on Mike constantly, telling him to get a job and stop hanging out with kids, meaning Richard. When Richard was just barely over 13 years old, on May 4th, 1973, Mike and Jessie were arguing in their kitchen in front of Richard and their own 2 young sons, when Mike took a gun out of the fridge and told Jessie that if she didn't shut up, he would kill her. She dared him to do it. Mike, who had never been treated for any sort of PTSD, shot Jessie directly in the mouth at point-blank range, killing her immediately. He then sent Richard home, first making a promise not to tell anyone that he had been there, which I actually think is weird because Mike was arrested almost immediately. So I'm not sure why he was so like dead set on Richard lying about being there, but I think he like called the cops and admitted it like right away. But either way, Mike was arrested and charged and eventually found not guilty by reason of insanity before being sent to a mental hospital for a whopping 4 years. He murdered his wife at point blank range with a gun for no reason in front of 3 minors and went to a mental hospital for 4 years. As you can imagine, this changed Richard forever. And I really think this was the final, straw for him becoming like his brothers, like his uncle, or even worse. And all of the good parts of him kind of lost and disappeared. And beyond whatever this insane trauma did to his brain, it also showed him that you can literally get away with murder and do very little time if you play your cards right. So lots and lots of bad things being shown to and in front of Richard. Now from here, Richard mostly dropped out of school, began smoking pot all day, every day, often with his older sister, and later that summer left El Paso to go visit his brother Julian out in LA. While there, he saw a ton of crazy shit, sex workers out in the open, drug users boldly using in the middle of the day, and all of this excited him. He was in love with the city. He was in love with the chaos. And more than anything, it made him want to get away from his parents and live his own life. And because he had had such a strict upbringing, the life he wanted to live was this life, like being on the streets, doing drugs, breaking the law. He came back home and at only 13 and a half years old, moved out of his parents' house to live with his sister Ruth and her new husband, Robert. And let me just say, this family knows how to fucking pick their partners, okay? Robert was a sex addict and a peeping Tom who taught Richard how to effectively spy on people without getting caught. Which is, just fucking great. Another failure of a man giving Richard more tools to be like an elite murderer, right? It's just crazy, this guy's luck with the people that he idolizes and that are like father figures to him. Anyway, even after Ruth left Robert for this behavior, which she did, Richard continued to live with her and continued to go out peeping with Robert. And then he decided to take it up a notch. Before he was even 14 years old, Richard began routinely breaking into people's homes and watching them sleep without them ever realizing it. And this is something that we've heard before. I don't know if I've covered any cases on my podcast, but there's definitely murderers who this is their first step. And once they get away with this for a long time, or even sometimes if they get caught, they escalate from here. Now, he later said when he would break into people's homes, he would imagine raping and murdering them and would become aroused at these thoughts. So he also ramped up his drug use and also began to focus on religion, but in a way to sort of rebel against his parents. So he wasn't thinking about joining, the church. Like many Mexican families, especially at that time, I think I've mentioned this, the Ramirez family were deeply religious and they followed the Catholic faith, which is pretty fantastical in its teachings. And that's not great for someone who has mental health issues and fantasizes about all sorts of stuff anyway, which Richard absolutely did. Now, maybe because his brain was mush, or maybe as a fuck you to his dad, Richard became obsessed with his version of Satanism and devil worship. And I say his version because, obviously real, Satanism is not about like doing evil deeds. It's not about like, killing people. It's totally different. But in any case, he was like obsessed with Anton LaVey, who founded the Church of Satan. I think he even met him at some point, which is like super fucking weird. He had a really interesting life, to be honest. But in any case, he was just getting really, really into this, right? So a lot going on, and it continues, of course, to get worse. When Richard was 16, because remember, all of this is when he's still a minor, like very much a minor, he got a job cleaning hotel rooms and somehow got his hands on a master key for the entire hotel. By this time, his rape fantasies were overtaking his own reality, and he felt he had to live them out. One night, he found a woman seemingly alone in her hotel room. He opened her hotel room door with the master key, then jumped on her and tied her up. He was in the middle of attempting to rape her when her husband walked in and beat Richard so badly he was knocked unconscious, yet again, and had to go to the hospital to get stitches for the inside of his mouth. He was then arrested, but lied both to police and to his mother and sister, saying that the woman had come onto him and the husband had caught them and beat him as a result, which is a really good lie to come up with. The woman he attacked lived out of state and refused to return to testify against Richard, so the whole thing kind of just went away, seen as a misunderstanding by his family, and he was free to continue escalating his behavior, which again, just like he saw with his Uncle Mike, proved to Richard that you can do bad things to women and basically just get away with it. Now, speaking of Mike, when Richard was 17, Mike was released and the two began spending even more time together. Around this time, Richard was nicknamed Fingers by his friends because he would steal anything that wasn't nailed down, including shit like from his friends. He and Mike were doing a ton of drugs, including LSD, and broke into houses nearly nightly. They would then, sell everything. Now, this went on for a year or so until finally, just weeks after turning 18, Richard, who was tired of his family and looking for something new, took a bus to Los Angeles and never looked back. He landed in Skid Row, which is like the gnarliest area of downtown, and by mid-1978, Richard had a hardcore cocaine addiction. While he sometimes stayed with his brother, I think Julian, after they had a falling out, Richard mostly slept on the streets or in stolen cars or in cheap hotels when he was able to steal enough for both his drugs and a place to stay, because the drugs always came first. Mostly, he stole cars to sleep in and was actually quite good at it, which comes into play later on. Now, to get money for his addiction, he would burglarize homes at night, then fence the items for money, then snort it or shoot it all up and do it all again. And his cocaine use led to him fantasizing even more about the devil, about rape, about violence and murder, and he fell deeper into this side of himself than he had ever allowed before. That same summer of 1978 is his second known attack. Just after moving to LA, he met a woman who took him back to her apartment to smoke some angel dust. Afterward, she made him leave. He actually tried to come on to her and she was like, "Nah, I'm a lesbian. Thanks so much, but get the hell out." And after she made him leave, instead of fully leaving, he waited on her roof for her to go to bed, which, how fucking creepy is that? Then climbed back down off of the roof, broke back into her house, tied her up, and raped her several times. This was the first time he was able to successfully attack a woman, and it sent him down a path that now lives on in infamy whenever California crime is brought up. For the next few years, it's not totally clear exactly what he was doing beyond more of the same shit. And as a note, he was arrested several times for auto theft, even doing a stint in jail. But he was always, released and would kind of no-show to court. So he did a small stint in jail, but he mostly just got arrested, was released, and went on his way. Stealing was his way of life. And in fact, later it's found he always took something from his victims as he just couldn't help himself but to steal. But really, he was just kind of bopping around and there wasn't a lot known about him. In 1983, when he was 23, he did spend those 5 months in jail on a stolen vehicle charge. And after this, his family became worried about him and his sister came to LA and begged him to come home. She said, "Come live with our parents, get your life together. We miss you. We're afraid for you. We want you to have a good life." Instead, Richard shot up cocaine in front of her and refused to go anywhere. He told her nothing bad would happen to him because he was protected by Satan. Ruth ended up leaving without Richard, and his fantasies completely took over. He never went back to El Paso again. One thing about Richard that I haven't really touched on yet is that apparently all throughout his childhood, on top of everything else, he was a major junk food and sugar addict. He always wanted sweet cereal, candy, desserts. It was basically all he ate. He grew up to be tall and thin despite these eating habits, but that's not to say the candy didn't affect him. Richard's teeth were rotting out of his head by the time he was in his early 20s. This was due to a mix of bad hygiene and too much sugar, which made for a very messy mouth. Not to mention the smoking of drugs, which of course didn't help the situation. Now, everybody talks about this, and I'm going to mention it. Overall, he was a handsome man. He had high cheekbones and nice hair, but anybody who got near him would always note his horrible breath, caused not only by his rotting teeth, but also because of halitosis, which is a really horrible smell that radiates out of your mouth, but actually originates from your stomach, which in his case was caused by bad eating habits and drug use. Halitosis is a much deeper stench than just mouth smell. And Richard had both, which is unfortunate. It's also, funny enough, part of how he was caught, or maybe it made it more clear he was the right man, because every survivor would be like, he had the worst breath I've ever fucking smelled. So I wanted to take a moment to discuss that because I feel like I would have been remiss to ignore it, because it's definitely a big part of Richard Ramirez, right? Also, I wanted to discuss his ties to the San Francisco Bay Area, because while most people think of him as terrorizing only the LA area, he also had a couple of victims up in the Bay Area, as he had friends who lived up there. One such friend, Earl Gregg, actually lived with Richard in the Bay Area for about 5 months in 1980. He said Richard was, quote, a nice guy, but he didn't trust him at all, and said he had to hide his money so Richard wouldn't steal it from him. It's so interesting how people are like, oh yeah, he's a really cool dude, but don't turn your back. He'll steal the fucking shirt off your back. He'll steal your wallet, but he's a really nice guy. Such a weird, dichotomy of thoughts. Anyway, Earl's mother-in-law, Donna Myers, met Richard while on a family vacation in El Paso in the late 70s, and for whatever reason, they all became friends. Even after returning to LA, Richard would come visit Donna every 4 to 6 weeks, presumably to get his head on straight after drug benders or to get out of Dodge after stealing cars or burglarizing homes in the LA area. Donna said that while Richard was really into Satanism and loved heavy metal bands like AC/DC and Judas Priest, he, quote, wasn't a weirdo, which makes me really question her judgment skills, to be frank. So now we know that Richard has ties to LA and to the Bay and is back and forth between the two very often. As I had mentioned previously, he was also staying with his brother in East LA off and on during this time. So he's sort of bouncing back and forth between the Bay Area and Los Angeles, staying with friends, staying with his brother, staying in stolen cars, or staying on the street. Now, he and his brother had a falling out at some point, which I previously mentioned. But until then, he was there quite a bit. And his brother had a young daughter named Rosie. Now, Rosie and Richard were very close when she was young. She actually wrote a book about her experience with Richard as her uncle and says one of her first memories of him was when they all went to Disneyland. She said she remembers him putting her on his shoulders and walking her around the park, which is a very sweet memory, but unfortunately is not what the book is about. The book is instead about the sexual abuse that she suffered at Richard Ramirez's hands. This abuse began, I believe, when Rosie was only 5 years old and Richard was 16. Now, while the family moved to LA when Rosie was pretty young, they did originally live in El Paso. And as I've noted, Richard was always trying to get away from his dad, trying to get away from his house. So he would stay with friends, he'd sleep in the graveyard, and he would go to his brother's home. And he and his niece were super close and everybody loved him and they got along super well and blah, 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 right? So the first time Rosie is ever molested by Richard is when she's only 5 years old. He's 16. And it wasn't much. It was just kind of the first hint that she got that something's maybe going to happen. So they're at her house watching TV. Her dad is at work and her mom decides to go take a shower. And she says, hey, Richie, can you keep an eye on Rosie for me? And he says, yeah, no problem. As soon as the shower turns on, Rosie said he flipped her over. She was laying on her stomach, watching TV, and started to pull her pants down. Now, Rosie didn't really know what was happening, but she knew to fight back, and she did. And luckily, she was able to fight him off long enough that her mother finished her shower. And as soon as Richard heard the water go off, he stopped what he was doing and acted like nothing happened. Now, in her book, Rosie talks about how she learned to survive by not bringing up her traumas, not telling her family what was happening, not letting people in, not letting people know. So she didn't say anything because that was kind of how their family behaved, which is really sad. But, also I get it. There's a lot of families like that. Now, this abuse continued even after her family moved to Los Angeles because then Richard also moved to Los Angeles. So it was a little bit in between this first attempted attack and when things started happening. But as soon as Richard moved to LA, he started staying with his brother, and the assaults really began in earnest. So I think she was like 7 when the first one happened, and after that, it became a regular thing. Now, what's interesting is like most of the time when you hear about Richard Ramirez, you don't hear about this. And I think this is sort of a newer development, and it's very, very scary to think about this because Rosie pointed out that the last time he ever tried to molest her was in December of 1983. Now, at this point, he's 23, she's 12, and he was so bold that he tried to actually touch her while her mother was in bed with them watching TV. Rosie pretended to be asleep and kicked him with her feet super hard as if she was having a nightmare. And this was the last time he ever attempted to touch her, probably because he and her dad then had a falling out, because I don't think he would have stopped otherwise. But what she noticed, and what I agree with, is that his no longer being able to touch her was in part what set him on the path. I mean, obviously molesting his niece, he's already on that path. But it's what set him out molesting and hurting other people. Because 3 months and 18 days after the last time he molested Rosie, on April 10th, 1984, he abducted, raped, and murdered 9-year-old Mei Lung in the basement of an apartment building in the Tenderloin area of San Francisco. So it was only 3 months after he hurt Rosie that he had to find another kid to victimize. Now, Mei had been playing in the apartment building, just running around being a kid, when she was grabbed by Richard, taken to the basement of the building, raped, stabbed, and then hung by her own blouse and left to die. The worst part of this is that her toes were just inches from being able to reach the floor. But hopefully she wasn't conscious to struggle. This was an absolutely fucking disgusting attack. And notably, it went 25 years without being solved. So when Richard Ramirez was caught, he was not charged for this crime. And in fact, he was never charged for this crime since he was already on death row when it was solved. So I think I'm going to stop here for the first half. I know we're just kind of getting into the meaty part, but I think the kind of creating of this monster is a really interesting piece to this story. And I think the information from his niece about their relationship and his consistent, molestation of her is a very interesting kind of newer fact that plays into kind of the timeline, the escalation, and kind of understanding the criminality of this absolute piece of shit. So I'm not going to wait 2 weeks to post the next one. I've almost finished the research, so I'm going to get this up in about a week. It won't be a full 2 weeks between episodes because I hate when people make me wait for the second part. I don't have it recorded, or I would post them back to back, but I'm just not on top of my shit. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this first part of the story of Richard Ramirez. I hope I shed some light on some things you maybe hadn't heard before. I really tried to get a lot of good research so that I could add something to the conversation. And I am excited to get back into his rampage and really discuss what happened, including one of my favorite captures of a criminal of all time. So I will see you all. I'll talk at you all in about a week. And until then, thanks so much for listening. Please like, rate, review, share with all your friends and family, help support small independent podcasts. It's a lot of work for us, but we do it out of love. And yeah, I guess that's all I got to say. So until next time, stay safe.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.